I'm going to start by just introducing myself. My name's Hyatt Frobos, and I'm currently the KSU Food for Thought president. And a little background on our group. In the fall of 2009, a group of undergraduate, graduate, and veterinary students came together informally to discuss the growing disconnect between the public and agriculture. As a result of that conversation, we created Food for Thought, which is a grassroots group of K-State students and young alumni who seek to bridge this gap. The average consumer today is more than 2 generations removed from the farm, and as a result, interest in where our food comes from and how it's produced is rapidly growing among consumers of all backgrounds. Food for Thought believes that it's our responsibility to provide our peers and community members with accurate, factual information about agriculture and to provide opportunities to discuss food production today. In addition to bringing speakers to campus, Food for Thought maintains a social media presence via Twitter, Facebook, and a blog, and partners with agricultural organizations across Kansas to promote agriculture to audiences throughout the state. Recently, the Upson Lecture Series, which is this event tonight, became fully endowed thanks to generous donations from the KSU veterinary medicine classes of 1962 and 1966. Their tremendous generosity ensures the Upson Lecture Series will continue to make great strides for American agriculture and connect producers and consumers for years to come. In November 2010, Food for Thought hosted a lecture by world-renowned animal behaviorist Dr. Temple Grandin. It was announced at that event that Dr. Grandin would be the first in a series of speakers entitled the new Dr. Dan Upson Lecture Series. Unfortunately, Dr. Upson wasn't able to be here with us tonight, but a little bit of background on Dr. Upson. He taught at the K-State College of Veterinary Medicine and Department of Animal Science for over 35 years before retiring with emeritus status in 1994. He's received several awards for his outstanding dedication to the classroom and veterinary profession, including the All-University Undergraduate Teaching Excellence Award, the Outstanding Educators Award, and the Award of Excellence from the American Association of Bovine Practitioners in 1994, as well as Kansas State University's highest award, the Alumni Medallion Award. When you think of K-State's history in agriculture and veterinary medicine, nobody has had a bigger impact on teaching students than Dr. Dan Upson. He's made numerous contributions through his years of teaching on our campus and continues to work with the beef industry and veterinary profession in this state and across this nation. Please join me in first and foremost acknowledging Dr. Dan Upson for his contributions to this event. With that, I'll transition to introducing our guests for tonight, and we're privileged to have Mr. Charlie Arnot, who currently is the CEO of the Center for Food Integrity and president of CMA, a consulting company with offices based in Missouri, Iowa, and Ohio. The Center for Food Integrity is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to building consumer trust and confidence in the U.S. food system. In his role as president of CMA, Charlie and the CMA team work with companies and associations across the food system to develop and implement sustainable solutions in issues management, public relations, strategic facilitation, and marketing communications. Prior to founding CMA, Charlie spent 10 years as Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs for Premium Standard Farms. Additionally, he's worked for a public relations agency, was an award-winning radio journalist, and worked in video and film. Charlie grew up in southeastern Nebraska and graduated from the University of Nebraska with a Bachelor of Journalism degree. And Charlie's unique perspective will shed some light on the relationship, development, and pattern of trust that consumers have with food and those who produce it. Please join me in welcoming Charlie to the stage.
Thank you, Hyatt. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you for coming, and thanks to Tim and Jody for providing the bacon to get everybody to be here. If you'd offered free beer, it might have been full, but bacon's a great start, so appreciate that. As Hyatt mentioned, when I graduated from high school, I didn't qualify to go to an institution of higher learning, so I went to the University of Nebraska. Many of you know that. That's where the N, of course, stands for knowledge on the helmet. You're probably aware of that. But we do have a good football team, and occasionally we have some players that are not maybe eligible academically, but they're a fair school, so they want to make sure everybody has a chance to qualify. So before the game one year, they had a star running back they really needed to perform, and they weren't sure if he was going to be academically eligible. But they decided they wanted to give him one more chance, so they brought him out to midfield before the game to give him a math test. The public address announcer came on and said, "What is 2 plus 2?" The running back scratched the N on the side of his helmet for luck, and he said, 4. It was dead silent. All of a sudden, 90,000 people in unison said, "Oh, give him another chance." So that's the University of Nebraska, just for that. Okay, I'm hoping this is on. Is this working? Can you hear me? All right, excellent. So I want to spend a little bit of time tonight talking about why size matters. Why is it that we hate big food? How did we get there? And then more importantly, what do we do about it? And what is the ethical choice for people, animals, and the planet as we kind of think about where we go from here? So today's food system, without question, generally is safer, more affordable, and more available than ever before. And yet there are more questions and more skepticism about food than there's ever been before. So how did that happen? How did we get to the place where we have a food system that is the envy of many in history, and yet more and more consumers continue to raise questions about the ethical choices and whether or not we're doing the right things in food? We can trace that all the way back to 1968, believe it or not. Time magazine declared that the year that shaped a generation. It was also the year we began to lose trust in institutions. And that, in turn, became the catalyst for why we lost trust in food. And we'll connect the dots between those as we continue to move forward. Both Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Martin Luther King were assassinated in 1968. The Democratic National Convention took place in 1968, where troops and police attacked protesters who were protesting the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was in full bloom, as was opposition to the war, with protests on more than 100 campuses around the country in 1968. And television, a relatively new communication medium, fundamentally changed the way that Americans looked at war and looked at the military. Because for the very first time, what was taking place on the battlefields was showing up in everybody's living room every single night on TV. So how people related to what was taking place in Vietnam was changed by the communication medium. We're seeing the same thing happen today between the food system and what's taking place in social media, where historically we've been very comfortable trying to control the message, control the images. That's no longer possible today because of the change in communication technology. So what happened to the military with the advent of television in the Vietnam War is very similar to what's happening to agriculture and the food system today because of the change in communication technology with the internet. Christmas Eve of '68 was also a milestone for the environmental community. It was the very first time we saw a picture of the Earth from outer space. So now we have this iconic image of the blue planet and a recognition that the resources we all share are limited. So that became a very important moment for the environmental community as well. You followed that up in 1970 with the tragic shooting of students at Kent State University who were opposing the war and were shot and killed by National Guard troops. 1972, the Watergate break-ins, which led to the resignation of President Nixon, shook confidence in our democracy to its very core. And for those of you who remember those dark days, there were a lot of questions about whether our elected officials, our democratic process, were still in fact worthy of public trust. It was a very dark moment in American history. We followed that up in other events in the 1970s and 80s, whether it's the Iran-Contra scandal, again, raising questions about government and military, 3 Mile Island and Exxon Valdez, raising questions about the trustworthy nature of the energy sector, Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker raising questions about the trustworthy nature of religious organizations and televangelists. More events in the 90s and 2000s raising questions about the trustworthy nature of institutions. We had another president who was impeached but not convicted with the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. Arthur Andersen and Enron, where the accounting profession had a very high social standard until that point in time. And then one of the largest accounting firms in the country was brought to disgrace and fundamentally destroyed confidence in the accounting profession and business as a result of that incident. More events in the 2000s, Abu Ghraib, John Edwards, Elliot Spitzer, Tiger Woods. We begin to see the continued pattern of high-profile incidents in individuals who violate public trust. The subprime mortgage collapse in 2008 rocked our financial situation to its core, was the catalyst for the global financial crisis that some countries are still recovering from still today. and raised significant questions about whether or not the financial industry and banks were worthy of public trust. Resulted in the passage of Dodd-Frank and other similar kinds of regulations all around the world. Other events in the 2000s, the BP oil spill in 2010, where their CEO, Tony Hayward, who was completely tone deaf, said, well, of course I want this over. I'd like my life back. As he got back on his private jet to go to his polo pony matches, completely oblivious to what was taking place in the Gulf. And then the tragedies at Penn State University. So over the last 45 years, we've been taught to become skeptical of institutions, whether it's business institutions, religious institutions, educational institutions, military institutions, governmental institutions. We've been taught to be skeptical about whether institutions are in fact worthy of trust. Prior to 1968, coming out of World War II, we had fairly broad social optimism and a lot of energy, all kind of moving collectively in a central direction. That began to erode in the 1960s, culminating in 68, and since that time, the frequency and visibility of trust-eroding events has been consistent enough that the cultural norm is now to be skeptical about whether institutions are worthy of trust. And food is so incredibly personal. We need it for survival. It's one of the very few things we need for survival. And conflict is both the cause and effect of food insecurity. When there's food insecurity, it generally results in conflict. When we see conflict, it generally results in food insecurity. So it becomes a very challenging situation. We provide it to those who are most vulnerable among us. We provide it to our children. We provide it to our elder parents. We provide it to those who can't provide for themselves. And mothers particularly take a special responsibility for that role in providing food for their children. Rarely do we gather that we don't gather around food. I mean, you even had bacon tonight coming into the auditorium, for heaven's sakes. So it's part of our culture and celebrations, right? Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, I convert faster than the best finishing pig in Kansas. It's true, 2.5 pounds a day, just like that during that period of time. So during that 45 years where we've been taught not to trust institutions because of their change in structure and who we are, in the food system, we've seen nothing but more consolidation, integration, industrialization, and application of technology, which has now caused the public to wonder whether we too have become an institution and as such are no longer worthy of public trust. So some pretty important social trends collide simultaneously to bring us to the situation where we find ourselves today, where we've lost trust in institutions and people now believe that the food system collectively has become an institution and as such is no longer worthy of public trust. So some pretty important social shifts. It used to be that authority was granted by office. If you held the title, if you'd been elected to an office, people would defer to you and grant you authority. Today, authority is granted more so by relationship, and that's never been more true than through social media. Who belongs to your Facebook group, who are your Facebook friends, helps determine to whom you will grant authority. We had broad social consensus driven by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. Today, there's no single social consensus, great diversity, and many voices as part of the conversation. And one of the things that organizations in agriculture and the food system struggle with today is which of those voices should we listen to? Which of those voices should help define and drive our strategy? Because the voices that we're hearing today are different, and they raise concerns that make us uncomfortable. Communication used to be very formal and indirect, mass communication. Growing up in rural Nebraska, we were lucky to get 3 television channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS, when the weather was good. But today, we've transitioned from mass communication to masses of communicators, where everyone has an opportunity to offer their input and feedback on whatever issue they choose. But the volume of information is such that each of us now sorts and sifts the information in a way that is specifically meaningful just to us, because we can't manage that incredible information flow. Now that's great, because it gives each of us the power over the internet. It gives us the ability to make use of that information in a way that's meaningful to us. But it also results in the communication today being much more tribal and much more insular than it's ever been before, because we all have a confirmation bias. We all tend to look for information from people like us, who think like us, who believe like us, and that limits our ability to have those broad-based kind of public conversations about important issues, like food, like nutrition, like health, like the environment, like agriculture. Because each of us now tends to sort and sift the information in ways that's just meaningful for us. If I were to take a look at the smartphones and tablets of everybody in this room, no two would be identical, because each of us has that power today to really sort and sift the information and only get the information that's specifically relevant to us. Gives us a great tool, but limits our ability to connect with others that aren't within our tribe or specific sphere of influence. We've always believed that progress is inevitable. In agriculture, we celebrate every tenth of a pound of gain, every additional bushel that we can bring off an acre. It's something that we've always celebrated as a march of progress. But today, progress is possible, but what we define as progress, others may not. They may view it as a threat to their particular way of life, to the way they view the food system, to how they want food to come to market. So some pretty important shifts have taken place over the last 45 years that create a very different environment in which we find ourselves today. And so how we move forward in this will help determine how people think, feel, and believe about who we are and what we do. So each year at the Center for Food Integrity, we ask people whether or not they believe the food system is headed in the right direction or on the wrong track. It's kind of a takeoff on the Gallup question that they used to do, or they still do historically, about how do people feel about the country? Is it headed in the right direction or on the wrong track? This year, 42% said right direction, 30% said wrong track, 27% were unsure. There are some subsets of the population that are significantly more critical than others. Early adopters, based on the Rogers model for adoption and diffusion and innovation, are historically those that are better educated, have broader social circles, higher income, and are the opinion leaders within their own social circle. 36% of early adopters believe the food system is headed on the wrong track. There are also important and meaningful gender differences as well. 48% of men believe the food system is headed in the right direction, while 32% of women believe it's on the wrong track. But here's what's interesting. For the first time this year compared to last year, we saw a significant improvement on this particular metric, an 8% change. Last year, only 34% said the food system was headed in the right direction, while 38% said wrong track. Roughly the same percent said unsure. So it'll be interesting to see in 2015 when we conduct the research if that trend continues. But it's interesting to see that change for the very first time, with more people believing the food system is headed in the right direction than they did the previous year. All of this happens to really be a developed world debate, right? These are first world problems, if you think about what's taking place. And we really aren't having much of a conversation, as Russ Parsons captured in his LA Times column. What we tend to have are two armed camps that are deeply suspicious of one another, lobbing bombs kind of back and forth. And we see that more and more in online communication, as people take hold in their bunker with that particular group, with their particular tribe, and decide that that's the position that they choose to defend. And we're so fortunate here in the US. We can have lunch at Chipotle or McDonald's, we can shop at Whole Foods or Costco or Walmart, but we've tended to kind of divide food into these two categories, right? You've either got controversial food or controversy-free food, and that all depends on your perspective. If you come from conventional agriculture, you may look at controversial food very differently than if you've decided that cruelty-free kale is going to be what you're going to have for lunch. So it just kind of depends on your perspective and what you decide is going to be controversial and what isn't. It's just a matter of your particular perspective and beliefs. But what we see here is a food system full of dichotomies. Don't know if you've heard or read David Hughes from the Imperial College of London. Great scholar, does a lot of work in this area. Great, terrific speaker if you have a chance to bring him to campus. But he talks about all the dichotomies and how people kind of align themselves with that as part of their identity. Some want it all year, some want it seasonal, low price, premium price, good for you, naughty but nice, all of those different challenges. And like so many other things that we see in the developed world, we've got this migration to the poles, right? I have to be right and you have to be wrong. It can't be that all of these choices are okay. We're not in that position in having a conversation about food. We have to pick winners and losers as part of that conversation. So divided we eat. As more of us indulge our passion for local organic delicacies, a growing number of Americans don't have enough. How do we bridge the gap? How do we begin to bridge that gap and change this conversation? So we don't have winners and losers. We have a recognition that there's a variety of choices, and all of those choices meet the needs of a variety of consumers. And that's okay. That's something we can celebrate about today's food system. Over the last 7 years, we spent quite a bit of time focusing on what it actually takes to build trust. And we have a peer-reviewed and published model that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking with you about now. Those of you who are involved in agriculture today are primarily interested in protecting your freedom to operate. How can you continue to do what you do best with a minimum amount of outside interference? Today, that requires us to consistently earn and maintain a social license. And we define that as the privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions based on maintaining public trust by doing what's right. If the public trusts us to do what's right, they won't impose more restrictions. Now, historically, we've always thought about social control or formal restrictions in the form of legislation or regulation. But we've done a fairly good job of perfecting gridlock. So a lot of times today, what we'll see is those restrictions come from the market, where interest groups and others will put pressure on a particular brand, and that brand will say to the supply chain, we don't want that product, we don't want that process, we don't want that ingredient as part of our supply chain, make it go away. And we've seen that happen with BST and dairy, with sow stalls for pork, with cages for laying hens, for tail docking, for dairy cattle, you name it. We continue to see that social control and that social license be dictated more so by the market than by legislation and regulation. Now, I want to spend a little time comparing and contrasting social license and social control, because I think I can make a fairly compelling case for the economic value of social license. Because at the end of the day, if there is no economic value for it, it makes it fairly difficult for a business to justify investing in social license. Now, Hyatt mentioned that I spent 10 years at Premium Standard Farms, and during my tenure there, not everything went well. We had a series of challenges, some of them environmental. In fact, at one point, we were sued by the state government, the federal government. Willie Nelson held a protest concert next to one of our farms. That was a professional highlight. Citizens groups sued us, so it was a great learning environment. There was a lot to be learned during that period of time. But after a series of spills, the state of Missouri came in and said, sorry, you violated the public trust. We no longer trust you to manage the nutrients in swine waste. We're going to change the regulatory scheme. We're going to impose more social control so that there's more oversight of what you do. And we knew from our benchmarking service that our cost of compliance was then 6 times the cost of our competitors in other states. So we made ourselves significantly less competitive because we lost the social license. Another example from outside of agriculture, going back to Arthur Andersen and Enron, the accounting profession had done a great job of establishing their own self-regulatory mechanism. The Financial Accounting Standards Board, you have to be a certified public accountant, generally accepted accounting principles, all of that was in place and going well until we had Arthur Andersen and Enron. Congress stepped in and said, sorry boys, you violated the public trust. They passed Sarbanes-Oxley, which requires much more stringent public reporting for publicly traded companies. And the average cost for a public company to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley is between $10 and $15 million a year. Those are dollars that aren't returned to shareholders. They aren't invested in R&D. They're simply invested in social control, in complying with social control. So a couple of key things to think about for those of you particularly that are going into the food system. The consequences for a bad actor don't accrue just to the bad actor. They accrue to the entire sector. So your social license is in my hands, my social license is in your hands. So we have a collective opportunity and obligation to raise the bar and hold each other accountable. Because it doesn't matter who screws up, everybody pays the price. The other thing, when we talk to farm audiences particularly, they say, well, what are consumers willing to pay for that? The answer is nothing. There's no premium for doing what's right. There's a penalty for violating it, but there's no premium for doing what's right. It's the basic social expectation. So it's really a matter of how do you manage that additional potential cost and how do you maintain maximum operational flexibility. Because once that's violated, it's gone, and once it's gone, it's never coming back. Not going to come back. But when we violated the social license, every pork producer in the state of Missouri paid the price because of what happened. So it's a matter of understanding we have that shared opportunity and that shared obligation to maintain social license. A few other illustrations. I'm sure many of you remember lean, finely textured beef, or what the media coined as pink slime, and what happened there. Once it was tied to the school lunch program, the product was driven from the marketplace, despite the fact that scientific evidence demonstrated that it was actually safer than other product. How many here are familiar with Food Babe? Oh yeah, she's interesting. Former computer analyst who's now developed the Food Babe Army, and it's really an interesting social phenomenon to watch what's taken place with Food Babe and how she's been able to generate that much interest and support without technical expertise, right? Because that tends to be what we think should determine whether or not people have influence. She's hot on GMOs and a whole range of other products, but she's got her good list and her bad list, the non-GMO snacks and the GMO snacks, kind of the bad list, and then the good list. And we'll talk more about her influence and why she has influence as we continue to go forward. So social license then is based on maintaining public trust. So the key question we wanted to answer was, what drives trust? How do we know what creates trust? So we partnered with Steve Sapp at Iowa State University to look into that question. And we began with a meta-analysis of 21 different pieces of research on the question of trust in food. And in each of those pieces of research, we identified the three drivers you see here on the left-hand side of the screen. At the very bottom, it's influential others. That's two groups. It's your family and friends, those in your immediate social circle, and credentialed individuals whose opinions you respect. Dietitians, doctors, veterinarians, kind of depends on the question being asked. The second element in building trust is competency. That's our technical capacity or our science. Now, historically, in agriculture, we have viewed this whole problem in building trust and connecting with consumers as an information deficit problem. We simply need to educate the public. We need to give them more information. If they had more information, they'd clearly come to our side of the argument. If they don't have the right information yet, and they haven't come to our side of the argument, then we'll go get some more science. And if they still haven't come to our side of the argument, we'll go get some more science. And we repeat that cycle over and over and over again, believing that it's competency that drives trust. The third element in building trust is confidence, or the perception of shared values and ethics. Can I count on you to do what's right? So once we'd identified those three drivers, we then surveyed 6,000 US consumers over the course of 3 years, asking them questions about food safety, on-farm animal care, sustainability, nutrition, a whole range of different questions. And what we discovered was that confidence, or shared values, is 3 to 5 times more important than demonstrating competency in building trust. So we've had the historical communication equation exactly backward, because we've always started with our competency. We've always started with the science. If I can prove where every pound of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus on my farm goes, surely that should be sufficient. You'll trust me and leave me alone. Not the way it works today, because of that loss of trust in institutions, because people aren't sure that institutions still share their values and are still committed to doing what's right. So when we talk about a sustainable balance at CFI, we use a triangle as the illustration for that because of its great structural integrity. And since shared values are the foundation for building trust, they're also the foundation for the triangle. We cannot abandon science. We absolutely must have objective, measurable, repeatable data to prove the claims we're making. And at the end of the day, if we're not economically viable, we're not truly sustainable. But here's where we tend to get the public conversation confused. Most of the questions come at the base of the triangle. Should you use GM ingredients? Should you use those preservatives? Should you use hormones? Should you use antibiotics? Should you use those crop protection chemicals? And our historical response has been, well, science says we can. Can and should aren't the same question. Can is a question about competency, should is a question about values and ethics. Science will tell us if we can, but society will tell us whether or not we should. We're pretty good at answering the can question. We need to get a lot better at answering the should question. Now, I happen to believe we've got good answers for the should question. Should you house animals indoors? Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I can tell you care a lot about animals. Actually, by moving them indoors, we're able to protect them from disease, from climate extremes, from predators, and do a better job of protecting their health. I'm so glad you're interested. What other questions do you have? And invite their skepticism, invite that conversation. Because when we give people information about economics and science, we increase their knowledge, but we may do very little to influence how they feel or what they believe. And people are much more likely to make decisions based on how they feel and what they believe than on simply what they know. That's why efforts to simply educate the public are not sufficient. Because information in and of itself is not the foundation for building trust. Shared values are 3 to 5 times more important than competency in building trust. And that's particularly important in today's radically transparent environment. Transparency is no longer optional. Again, television was to the military in the Vietnam War what the internet is to food today. It's fundamentally changed our ability to control the situation. We have no control any longer. Transparency is no longer optional. So the question isn't, are you going to be transparent? The question is, how are you going to manage that? Because we used to believe that if we could just manage what's going on up here in this top red bubble, Production, processing, distribution, life would be grand, right? Those are the big challenges. But today, we are intricately connected to our customers, grocery stores, restaurants, and brands who are constantly under pressure from NGOs and others who want to know what they're going to do about these variety of issues. Then when you add the pressure and the immediacy of social media to that dynamic, that radically transparent environment becomes radically volatile. And decisions could be made very, very quickly that have an impact all the way back through the supply chain. And in that environment, today's communication is much less effective. The traditional communication model, where we used to have an expert, they'd come down with their 2 tablets from the mount, deliver that information to consumers, but that's not how it works in the tribal communication model in which we operate today. Over the last few weeks, we've been working on some focus groups around the country on transparency primarily, but it's interesting because when we ask consumers, where do you go for information, they said there's no single source that we go to anymore. We go to a variety of different sources that are kind of consistent with our values. We synthesize that information to come up with our opinion or attitude about a particular issue. So there's no single source that people are going to any longer. And that tribal communication behavior that I talked about before is real and meaningful. From some focus groups we did in Orlando, what information sources have you used to come to your conclusion that GMOs are dangerous? Heidi was telling us that she didn't like GMOs. She was concerned they were a problem. We said, well, that's interesting, Heidi. So help us understand, what sources did you use to come to that conclusion? And she said, well, I'm part of a mom's group. When there's a big consensus, I think there's something here. You don't need doctors or scientists confirming it when you have hundreds of moms. Okay? That's the reality in which we live today. So we can say, well, Heidi, you're clearly an idiot, so change your mind. Not likely to be successful. Or we can recognize that that's our new reality, so what do we do with it? How do we operate in that kind of environment? Tribal behavior also leads to tribal shunning, right? If you don't operate in a way that's consistent with the tribal culture, you're no longer wanted. You're out of the tribe. Mommy shaming is a big deal online when it comes to food today. Happens a lot. Here's Lisa. I think mom guilt's a huge factor. If someone's telling you something is dangerous, for example, fructose, you hear the message more than once, you owe it to yourself to research it or quit consuming it. I can't keep giving my kids fructose if there's a potential problem. We have to do our best job. Now, a couple of different ways we could think about engaging with Lisa. We could say, Lisa, here are 4 peer-reviewed studies on fructose that tell you there's really nothing to be concerned about. Or we could say, you know what? I really appreciate your concern, and I'm so glad that you want to do your best job as a mom. There's no more important job anywhere on the planet than being a good parent. I really respect that, and I admire that that's what you want to do. And I understand that doing that today is more complex and complicated than it's ever been before. Getting the kind of information you want to make the food decisions that are right for you and your family is a tough thing to do. How can we be a resource to you? How can we provide information that helps you make decisions that are right for you and your family? So let's become her ally. Let's become a resource as opposed to becoming an adversary, because we don't want to win an argument. We want to win a friend. That's where we want to go in the process. And Food Babe does a fabulous job with this. This is from an email I got from her on Valentine's Day. She said, I'm just a regular everyday person like you. Shared values, right? I'm not like them, I'm like you. We're part of the same tribe. Don't let anyone ever tell you you have to be a nutritionist or scientist to figure this out. We're not like them, they're not part of our tribe. We all have the ability to change our bodies, our health, and the world once we find out what's really in our food. Brilliant positioning. Really, really smart. Doesn't make her any more credible, but it makes her more effective in terms of connecting. She's very smart about that approach. So when we asked consumers a couple of years ago in research, what's it going to take for you to not hate big food? They said, you've got to be more transparent. So we've been on a journey since 2013 to really begin to try and define what does that mean. We've made great progress, but by the end of this year, we'll be coming out with some specific best practice recommendations for food, farmers, and others. And in agriculture, we've kind of got this weird relationship with transparencies where we tell people, you know, we have nothing to hide, but it's none of your business, right? And so we got to kind of pick one of those. We can't continue to try and do both. It doesn't work. So we got to pick one. And I would urge you to pick being transparent, because today that's no longer optional. So it's really about overcoming that bias against size. When we ask people, why is it that you have such a problem with big? What's the problem with big? They said, well, really, three basic things. One, anything that's an industrial process is devoid of values. And if it's devoid of values, I can't connect to it. I don't know what that means. The second one is a belief that anything that is mass-produced creates a greater opportunity for error, and because it's mass-produced, the impact of the error will be greater. May or may not be true. The third one was the primary driver, and that is a belief that larger organizations are more likely to put profit ahead of public interest, that somebody within that organization is going to take a shortcut when it comes to food safety, to nutrition, to animal care, to the environment, in order to pad the bottom line, to get their quarterly numbers, to get their bonus, whatever it is they have to do, somebody's going to take a shortcut and put profit ahead of public interest. I want to be clear, no one objected to business being profitable. They want business to be profitable, but they want a recognition that you also, in business, that we also have an obligation to public interest, that those are shared interests that we have to recognize and acknowledge as well. So we know that shared values are the foundation for building trust, and that people believe that big is bad. And we've got that measured. There's an inverse relationship between size and that perception of shared values. We give consumers a variety of different statements and ask them to rate their level of agreement. This was from 2013. I believe small food companies are likely to put their interest ahead of my interests. 31% strongly agree with that statement. 53% strongly agree that large food companies are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest. 28% strongly agree that small farms are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest, while 48% strongly agree that large farms are likely to put their interest ahead of my interest. So the bias against big is real and measurable, and something that has to be overcome, and it can be overcome by increasing transparency. Increasing transparency had the greatest impact on the two groups who were most skeptical, early adopters and women. So it has the most positive impact on those who are most skeptical among consumers. So through secondary research, we identified 7 primary drivers of trust-building transparency: motivation, disclosure, stakeholder participation, relevance, clarity, credibility, and accuracy. So in terms of thinking about your approach, here are some things you can think about embracing for your organization. Motivation. Act in a manner that is ethical and consistent with stakeholder interest. Show you understand and appreciate issues, and demonstrate that you put public interest ahead of self-interest. Recognize and talk about the fact we have an obligation to take care of the planet, to take care of animals, to produce safe food, to do what's right, to contribute to our communities. Disclosure. Share information important to stakeholders, both positive and negative, even if it might be damaging. Make it easy to find, helpful in making informed decisions, easy to understand, and timely. Provide the kind of information people are looking for about who you are. Ask them what kind of information is relevant. Stakeholder participation. This one's hard because we tend to want to believe that nobody else should be involved in our business, right? My business is my business, and independence has been one of the bedrocks of agriculture in the United States. But asking those who are interested in your activities and impact for input, making it easy to provide, acknowledging it's been received, and explaining how and why you make decisions can go a long way to alleviating angst. So if you give people voice, you acknowledge they've been heard, you explain how and why you make decisions. Even if they don't like your decision, they're much more likely to be supportive because you involve them in the process. Relevance, share information stakeholders deem relevant, ask them, show you understand. Clarity, share information that's easily understood. Taking technical information and making it more easily understood is not dumbing it down. It's making it accessible to people who want to know. There's an art to making that happen. Credibility. Admit mistakes, apologize, accept responsibility, engage your critics, share plans for corrective actions, demonstrate you genuinely care, and present more than one side of controversial issues. And accuracy, share information that's truthful, objective, reliable, and complete. There's a difference between being honest and being forthcoming. People want us to be forthcoming, not just honest, in sharing the information that's important to them. So those 7 elements of trust-building transparency can go a long way to reestablishing credibility, overcoming the bias against size, and helping people become more comfortable that today's food system does, in fact, offer social, environmental, and other benefits that they're looking for. So in that context, we ask the question again, what is the ethical choice? What is the ethical choice for people, animals, and the planet? Wen Jiabao, the former premier of China, said his dream was to make sure that every child in China had enough milk. At the same time, the First Lady is leading an obesity drive for children in the US because we have an obesity epidemic. Both of those are legitimate social concerns tied to food, raising different questions about what is the ethical choice. It's a great question to ask, and many people would say, well, the right answer is to simply turn the clock back, right? If we simply went back to the way things used to be, everything would be okay. Well, let's examine that question. 1950, we had about 154 million people in the US, 5.5+ million farms. One farmer produced enough to feed 30. Last year, population roughly 312 million, roughly 2 million farmers. One farmer produced enough to feed 155. So if we simply went back and the level of productivity and the number of farms had remained constant, there would be no food for anyone in California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, or Georgia. Almost half the US would have nothing to eat. Now, you may be looking at some of those states and going, I'd be okay with that. But half the population? Probably not. So it'd be very difficult to argue that in fact, that simply rolling the clock back would be the ethical choice. And if you think about the productivity improvements, we need to think about how we position them differently to help people understand not the benefits to agriculture, but the benefits to society. Because the amount of land used per capita to produce all the meat, milk, poultry, and eggs in the US declined by 2/3 from 1960 to 2010. That means if you live in an office, or you work in an office, you live in a house built since 1960, chances are that used to be farm ground because it had to be. But it doesn't have to be anymore. That gives us more green space for parks, for homes, for people, for other uses because it doesn't have to be used in agriculture. There are other social benefits. And we're all familiar with the incredible demand for more and really what's driving it. By mid-century, we're going to be home to about 2.5 billion more people. 6 million monthly, that's about another Houston and Los Angeles every single month. Significant demands in terms of the additional population. But that's not really what's driving the change. It's part of what's driving the change, but the real driver is the increased consumption because of the increased income and the growing middle class in India and China. That's the fundamental driver. Because yes, population is going to increase, consumption significantly more, but it's all really driven by a nearly 180% increase in GDP. So if we look at what happens and really kind of thinking about this and putting it in a different kind of context in the China phenomenon or the India phenomenon, we're taking a look here at kind of population at the start of a growth period and the number of years it took to double GDP per capita. So in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, they had 9 million people. It took them 155 years to double GDP per capita. China started with 1,023 million. It took them 12 years to double GDP per capita. So China's doubling of GDP was 12 times the speed of Britain during the Industrial Revolution at 100 times the scale. So during that 12-year period, 400 million people, more than the population of our entire country, were lifted out of poverty. That's the power of economic development and economic growth. But it also has a significant impact on eating patterns and eating consumption. If you look at the period of time that it took to double, more than double beef consumption or meat consumption in China, from 1980 to 2007, it went from 20 kilograms to 50 kilograms of meat. That's important because it takes about 1,000 to 2,000 liters of water to produce a kilogram of wheat, 10 to 13,000 liters to produce a kilogram of beef. So the environmental consequences for that changing pattern of diet is significant in terms of thinking about what that means. Now people say, well, then the answer is to simply tell them to eat less meat, right? Good luck with that. We did some calculation and discovered that the correlation between increased consumer spending and increased meat consumption from 1960 to 2006 globally, the correlation is 0.998. So you're not likely to be able to tell people, okay, your income's improving, but we don't want you to eat more meat. We just won't want you to do that because it's not good for everybody else. Not going to happen, okay? So if that's not going to happen, that means we have an obligation to find ways to do more with less. Because that's the only way we're going to make it work. Because there's growing resource scarcity. By 2030, 47% of the global population is going to live in arid areas, and Asia has the lowest per capita land water availability in the world. So the geographic area where all of this expansion is taking place is not going to be able to feed itself. Not going to happen. So it's going to rely on Brazil and parts of Europe and parts of North America to provide what has to be provided as we continue to move forward. And we're not currently consuming at a rate that is sustainable on our planet. We're not consuming resources at about 1 globe a year. We're currently consuming at about 1.5 Earths per year. Now, Walmart doesn't sell the Earth, so we can't go buy any more. So we only have the one we have to work with. That means, again, we have to do more with less. 80% of that future growth and production is going to have to come from increased yields through the responsible use of innovation and technology. This is where social license comes in again. Because if we can't build the public trust for that kind of technology and innovation, it won't be available. And the consequences of that are too serious for us not to make sure that happens. 10 to 15% can be achieved from higher cropping density, only 5 to 10% from the expansion of land use. There's some land yet to be developed in Africa, but most of the arable land around the world is already in production. So there's no more land to be brought in. Norman Borlaug in 2000 said, before he passed, the world has the technology to feed on a sustainable basis 10 billion people. The pertinent question is whether farmers and ranchers will be permitted to use it. That's the opportunity for each of us to be engaged in this social conversation, so we can help assure that farmers and ranchers have the ability to use that technology to meet that growing global demand for food. If we don't, and it's not available, the consequences to all of us are significant. Jason Clay from World Wildlife Fund serves on our board of directors at the Center for Food Integrity. Got great material up on TED Talks if you haven't seen him, one of the brightest people I've ever met. He said, by almost any measure, producing food has the largest impact of any human activity. Most estimates suggest we need to produce twice as many calories on the same amount of land we use today if we want to maintain biodiversity and ecosystem functions. Twice the number of calories on the land in production today. That's a tall task, and it's not going to happen without the additional technology. So we need to shift the focus, right? The current conversation is not helpful. So let's choose your system regardless of what it is. Let's stop the debate about what's the right system or the wrong system. There's more than enough room for organic and conventional and niche production. There's plenty of room in the marketplace. Doesn't matter what system it is, double productivity. Regardless, double the productivity. Focus on performance, not the practices, to produce more with less. And we keep talking about these persistent issues, globalization, GMOs, animal welfare, organics, buying local, when we really ought to be talking about the important issues. Resource scarcity and waste. About 1/3 of the calories today that are produced are wasted. Most of those in the developed world are post-consumer. In the developing world, they never get to the consumer. They never make it to market. Food security and global trade. Challenges to making sure we can produce food where it's most efficient and get it to the areas where it's most needed. Pre-competitive approaches. Can we deal with these social challenges on a pre-competitive basis and bring industry sectors together? And food fraud is rampant. Less than half the grouper sold in the US has any grouper DNA, particularly rampant in fish. But food fraud and illegal products continue to threaten the security and stability of our food system. So what is the ethical choice? I would argue that it's our opportunity to support responsible food production systems that allow us to produce the food we need using fewer resources to meet the growing global demand for food. That's the ethical choice for people, animals, and the planet. I really appreciate you coming tonight. Thank you again for bringing the bacon, and I look forward to your conversation and questions. Thank you.